Meeting to order. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. And Mr. Pierce, Mr. Stringham, Mr. Ahern, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and thanks for being with us. And we've got representatives here in person from Canadian Fuels Association, Canadian Propane Association, and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and also joining us by video are other representatives from the Canadian Fuels Association and petroleum producers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Canadian Fuels Association, Mr. Bogue, I believe, for 10 minutes or less.
Yes, great. Well, thank you very much, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Yes, my name is Peter Bogue, and I'm the president of the Canadian Fuels Association, and with us via video conference from Calgary this morning is Brian Ahern, our vice president of our Western Division and one of our lead leadership people on this particular file. Well, first I'd like to say, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in your examination of the safety regime for the transportation of dangerous dangerous goods. It is a very important subject, and we very much appreciate being here today. For clarity, the Canadian Fuels Association represents Canada's petroleum refining sector. That's the companies that refine, distribute, and market petroleum products across the country. They're the manufacturing component of Canada's oil and gas value chain, converting crude oil into transportation fuels, which is about 75% of the sector's output, as well as a broad range of other products, including home heating oil, asphalt for roads, and petrochemical feedstocks that are essential components in hundreds of consumer goods that Canadians use and rely on every day, from plastics to textiles to pharmaceutical products. The transportation fuels our members produce are a vital component of Canada's energy system. 30% of the energy that Canadians consume is for transportation. That's close to 90 billion liters of fuels such as gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel every year. These are the fuels that keep our economy moving and enable our high standard of living. With our vast geography and dispersed population, it should come as no surprise that Canadians are among the highest per capita users of transportation fuels in the world. 18 refineries in 7 provinces produce the fuels Canadians rely on for 95% of their transportation needs. Getting fuel from the refinery to wholesale and retail customers is accomplished through a distribution system comprising a network of transportation assets, pipelines, trucks, trains, ships, 21 primary fuel distribution terminals, 50 regional terminals, and some 12,000 retail sites across the country. Pipeline and truck are the primary modes of shipping fuels from the refinery to market. Rail service is generally used when long distances are involved and there is no pipeline. For some locations, rail may be the only mode of transportation available. For example, many of Canada's northern communities rely exclusively on the rail supply of fuels. The majority of crude oil that's shipped into refineries is via pipeline and marine tanker. But rail supply of crude is increasing, and it's a relatively recent development. And it's a reflection of Canada's expanding oil production that is outgrowing our oil transportation infrastructure and the desire of eastern Canadian refineries to gain access to western Canadian crude, for which pipeline access does not exist. Rail is also an important transportation mode for the transport of biofuel inputs, principally ethanol and biodiesel, that are blended at the terminal to meet provincial and federal biofuel blending requirements. Now, Canadian Fuels Association members place a very high priority on protecting the health and safety of employees, contractors, and their neighbors. They conduct their business with a dedication to safe and sustainable operation that goes well beyond companies and boundaries and extends into the communities where they operate. They've developed an excellent safety record, operating alongside Canadian communities for more than 100 years. Indeed, the safety record of Canadian Fuels members' refineries is among the highest of all Canadian manufacturers, and their safety record continues to improve. Total recordable injuries for refinery, distribution, and retail employees are down nearly 80% across the sector since the year 2000. This record is the result of tight management across all facilities, systems, and processes to prevent incidents, as well as constant attention to safety by all employees. 5 elements drive our safety management efforts: a safe work culture, integrated planning and operations, sharing resources in emergencies, continuous improvement in all our safety-related activities, and a commitment to leadership in all safety matters. Our members have a very active spill prevention and response system for the truck transport of petroleum products. We have a mature national program in place based on 3 critical principles: prevention, preparedness, and response. Now, for the rail transport of petroleum products, our members rely heavily on the rail carrier for the care and custody of our products. They expect rail carriers to conduct their operations with the same care and commitment to safety as they do in their refinery operations. Thus, the focus for improving the safety regime for the transportation of dangerous goods by rail must be on requirements for safer rail operations. From that perspective, we support the recent Transportation Safety Board recommendations on enhancing the safety of rail operations. But a safe TDG regime extends beyond rail operations. To that end, Canadian Fuels and its members are actively involved with Transport Canada in an examination of additional measures in the areas of prevention and preparedness and response. We've been working closely with our upstream colleagues at CAP on a coordinated petroleum industry response and input to recent Transport Canada initiatives. We are an active member on working groups established by Transport Canada. We support recent working group recommendations provided to Minister Raitt to implement tank car design enhancements for DOT 111 cars and to enhance emergency response through expansion of the Emergency Response Assistance Plan program and the establishment of a cooperative single-entity response organization. With respect to new tank car standards, we support a risk-based approach to implementation of new means of containment standards that put a priority on high-risk substances, provides realistic timelines for replacement and retrofitting of existing cars, and maintains alignment with regulatory requirements in the United States. Recognizing that much of the northern communities, that many of Canada's northern communities completely rely on the rail supply of fuels, we really recommend that the government and this committee in its recommendations pay appropriate attention to prioritizing the competing demand of new tank cars for products versus crude to ensure that we don't unnecessarily constrain the ability of northern communities to have access to the fuel they desperately need. On emergency response enhancements, while supporting expansion of the ERAP program, the Emergency Response Assistance Plan program, that was a recommendation of a recent working group, a recent recommendation from the working group examining this issue, we have highlighted the risks of a major expansion of ERAP requirements to all flammable hydrocarbons without substantive modifications to the current ERAP framework. We see the need for a more consistent and coordinated approach to response through the development and implementation of a single national entity, for response to rail incidents and rail spills. And we believe that rail carriers, are best placed to lead that new entity. To that end, Canadian Fuels Association and our colleagues at CAP have initiated discussion with the Rail Association of Canada to further advance the concept of a single entity emergency response organization. As well, we're in close discussions with the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs to examine how to better address the transport of dangerous goods, product education and training needs, of first responders. An existing program, TRAN, well established with our colleagues at the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, is being actively considered as a potential platform for addressing first responders' TDG product education needs for petroleum products and crude oil. So to summarize, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, we recognize that public confidence in the safety of the transportation of dangerous goods has been shaken. We accept that improvements in the safety regime for the transportation of dangerous goods are necessary to restore confidence. Safe operations are a cornerstone of our industry, so we're committed to working with government and stakeholders to achieve the necessary improvements. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Bogan. We'll now move to the Canadian Propane Association. We have Mr. Marchand and Mr. Byte. 10 minutes or less, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, membres du comité. Je suis accompagné ce matin de...
I'm here this morning with Mr. Lebel and Andy Byte, who is also on the Board of Administration. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and speak about the transportation of propane by rail. The Canadian Propane Association is the national voice of the Canadian propane industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry that impacts the livelihoods of tens of thousands of Canadians. The CPA represents over 380 members that include producers, wholesalers, retailers, transporters, equipment manufacturers, service providers, and industry associates. The CPA's mission is to facilitate the growth and best practices of performance for the propane industry in Canada by acting as a unified champion for a safe and vibrant industry, regardless of geography or place on the propane value chain. Headquartered in Ottawa, The CPA maintains an office in Calgary that houses the CPA's subsidiary, the LPG Emergency Response Corporation, a propane industry emergency response plan, and the Propane Training Institute, which trains over 24,000 students annually. Concerning the industry, Canada produces around 11 billion litres of propane annually. In Canada, approximately 85% of propane is produced from natural gas processing and 15% from crude oil refining. Approximately half of the supply is used domestically, and the rest is exported to the United States. Nearly 100% of propane consumed in Canada is produced domestically. Every year, the propane industry makes $10 billion impact on the Canadian economy and contributes over $900 million in annual taxes and royalties. Propane is used in a wide variety of applications, including home heating, industrial process, agriculture, and transportation. The propane industry is governed by a number of acts, regulations, codes, and standards at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. The transportation of propane is regulated under the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act and regulations, which specify certain requirements for transporting propane, such as means of containment, safety marks, and emergency response assistance plans. At the federal level, Environment Canada requires propane companies and users with large quantities of propane on their property to have an environmental emergency plan. The storage and handling of propane is regulated by provincial authorities, such as the Technical Standards and Safety Authority in Ontario, the Régie du Bâtiment in Quebec, and the British Columbia Safety Authority in BC. These agencies administer national codes and standards that prescribe the proper practices and appropriate training for the handling and use of propane and propane equipment. Canada has a well-developed propane infrastructure across Canada and into the United States, through which propane is transported by rail, pipeline, truck, and marine. Approximately 4 billion litres of propane are shipped by rail within Canada, and 3.5 billion litres are shipped by rail to the U.S. The propane industry takes every possible measure to meet and exceed regulatory requirements for the safe transportation, delivery, and use of our product. And we're very pleased to be part of the discussion to maintain and, where possible, improve the high level of safety for the transportation of dangerous goods by rail.
Takes every precaution to ensure the safety of all who transport, handle, and use the product. One important element in the safe transportation of propane by rail is the design of the rail cars. Propane rail cars are designed to carry as much as 114,000 litres, or about 33,000 U.S. gallons of propane. The rail cars themselves are equipped with various devices and safety systems to protect the tank and fittings from damage during an accident or a severe impact. These safety systems include pressure relief devices, which are fittings designed to relieve the internal pressure within a tank car above a specified value that may be resulting from abnormal pressure increases. Tank cars transporting propane are also equipped with a tank head puncture resistance system capable of sustaining, without the loss of lading, coupler to head impacts of 18 miles per hour. This is usually accomplished by the installation of separate head shields or full head tank jackets made of half-inch thick steel on each end of the tank car. And the tank cars themselves transporting propane must be equipped with thermal protection or an insulation system that provides sufficient thermal resistance so that there will be no release of any lading except through the pressure relief device, which when subjected to a pool fire for 100 minutes or a torch fire for 30 minutes. The thermal protection systems are typically protected with an outer steel jacket. Additional safety features include loading and unloading valves and fittings that are located on top of the tank car and are enclosed in a protective dome. The tank cars are also equipped with positive shut-off valves and safety check valves. Another important element of ensuring the safe transportation of propane is the training of personnel on the proper procedures for loading and unloading a tank car. This training is offered by the Propane Training Institute, which is a division of the Canadian Propane Association, and was specifically designed for the purpose of training propane plant operators responsible for unloading rail cars and for use as a reference manual on the job. The unloading of propane rail cars can be summarized in 9 steps, which include several safety measures. First, the rail car is secured for unloading. The rail car is then inspected to make sure that it is free from damage or leaks that would create a hazard during unloading operations. The contents of the rail car at this point are tested to ensure, among other things, that the propane has been properly odorized. To avoid accidentally overfilling a storage tank, the maximum amount of propane that can be added to it will be calculated. Then, as most plants use an unloading riser to gain access to the top openings of the rail cars, the liquid and vapor hoses between the rail car and the unloading riser will be connected using special connectors equipped with emergency shut-off valves. A compressor is then used to evacuate the liquid propane from the rail car into the storage container. The compressor is then reversed and the propane vapors are evacuated from the tank car to a relatively low pressure. Once the transfer is complete and before letting the carrier remove the tank car, the hoses will be disconnected and the valves will be shut off. During the entire transfer operation, a qualified person is present to monitor the transfer and to handle emergencies should they arise. Regular inspections of the facility and its operations are performed by the railroads as well as the provincial gas authorities to evaluate compliance and safety. We also have an LPG Emergency Response Corporation. In the unfortunate event of an incident, the LPG Emergency Response Corporation, a subsidiary of the Canadian Propane Association, has a national network of experienced and trained remedial measures advisors and response teams offering 24/7 emergency response to transportation as well as stationary tank incidents. The LPGRC plan provides emergency response to support all UN 1075 liquefied petroleum gases and UN 1010 butadiene stabilized products for over 250 plan participants. The LPG Emergency Response Plan is approved by Transport Canada as per the regulatory requirements listed in Part 7 of the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Regulations for Emergency Response Assistance Plans. As we have said in our presentation, the propane industry takes all necessary steps to ensure the product is delivered safely to consumers as well as end users. Thus, we are leaving you with 3 CPA positions and related recommendations regarding the transportation of dangerous goods as it relates to propane. First, the CPA supports the safe transfer of propane and believes that Transport Canada should review the regulatory requirements for transfers from rail to truck. In our view, the safety requirements should be consistently applied to different types of transfers, which currently is not the case. Example, rail to storage, rail car to truck. We believe that there is a gap in the regulations. Second, the CPA supports compliance with regulatory requirements and enforcement where compliance is not achieved. Accordingly, the CPA recommends that Transport Canada consider developing, maintaining, and executing a risk-based compliance inspection program. Thirdly, the CPA supports the harmonization of transportation of dangerous goods regulations between the United States and Canada, as significant amounts of propane move between the two countries. The equipment designed for propane applications is also very similar on both sides of the border. Where it is practical to do so, Transport Canada should seek to harmonize the transportation of dangerous goods regulations with international regulations and national standards. Propane is an available and abundant energy source in Canada. It provides heat and power to homes and businesses. It has a multitude of uses that include fuel for home appliances, forklifts, and heat for mines and remote locations. Propane is also an essential energy source for those in rural areas, as it is highly portable and also a cleaner burning option over heating oil and wood. In urban areas, it is also used to power forklifts and fleet vehicles. As supply continues to grow with the increase in natural gas production, the propane industry is committed to working with government and the railways to ensure the safe and reliable transportation of our product. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And now we will go to Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And Mr. Blaney, 10 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And thanks for the opportunity to appear before you here today. My name is Bob Blaney, and I'm the Vice President of Ottawa and Eastern and Atlantic Canada at CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. With me today via video conference in Calgary is David Price, CAP's Vice President of Western Canada, and Greg Stringham, our Vice President of Oil Sands. Before I start, I'd like to establish that as shippers, we are not experts in rail. Therefore, we're bringing our broader expertise to bear on our views as a user of rail services. Our industry produces and transports 3 million barrels per day of oil, serving Canadian consumers and export markets. This year, the oil and gas industry will generate over $100 billion in revenues. These revenues serve as capital investment, labor, purchased goods and services, and government revenues of royalties and taxes. Every molecule of energy that generates this revenue and jobs for Canadians must be transported from its source to the end market. Thus, sufficient, safe, reliable, and timely transportation capacity is critical to our industry and to the Canadian economy. For our industry, this includes pipeline, rail, marine, and truck transportation. Approximately 200,000 barrels a day of crude is being shipped by rail in Canada today. It is expected to grow by another 100,000 barrels a day in 2014 and could grow to as much as 700,000 barrels a day by 2016, providing further impetus for enhancements to the safety and integrity of transportation by rail. As per this committee's 2008 Rail Safety Report recommendations, Transport Canada and the rail industry were asked to develop action plans and assessment tools to monitor progress of safety management systems. CAP views safety culture as key to overall safety management and important in safety performance improvement. The oil and gas industry has long recognized the role played by a positive safety culture in improving personnel safety and in the prevention of major incidents. With respect to safety management systems, these are commonly coupled with environmental compliance requirements and have long been used to implement policy and standards consistently across organizations in our industry. These are subject to ongoing adjustment as new hazards and challenges confront industry, new personnel joining the workforce, and new regulations are introduced. It's worth highlighting that regulatory requirements as to proof of compliance can contribute to management systems that become over-documented bureaucratic mechanisms that do little to improve overall safety. We would caution the linkage between management systems, control of risk, and personnel attitudes to safety can suffer as a result. Regulators are in a unique position to provide leadership, clarify expectations, and support industry as it strives to improve safety performance. And we view there is significant opportunity to examine existing regs to identify their effect on operator safety performance. As shippers, we rely on the transporters' expertise and expect that they have the mechanisms in place to ensure the safe transportation of our products. CAP supports recent Transportation Safety Board recommendations that would advance safety enhancements for rail operations. These recommendations include setting stringent criteria for the operation of trains carrying dangerous goods, as well as requiring railway companies to conduct route planning and analysis and perform periodic risk assessments to ensure that risk control measures work. It is critical that railroads are running a safe system. That is our expectation and their job, and view that Transport Canada should continue working with rail towards improving safety performance in these operations. With regards to the transportation of dangerous goods, it's CAP's view that a number of initiatives already in progress will play a key role in this committee's review of the current TDG regime. These initiatives cut across the following three pillars: prevention, preparedness and response, and liability. Within the context of these three pillars, Transport Canada has initiated a review of regulatory and policy requirements that will examine adequacy of railcar design, emergency response, and third-party liability and compensation. CAP and our colleagues from the Canadian Fuels Association have been working collaboratively on these files, as was referenced by Peter in his presentation, and we offer a shared perspective across these three pillars. The first pillar, prevention. With respect to the means of containment, proposed tank car regulations will replace existing standards and will require that new DOT 111 cars be built with thicker steel requirements, as well as adding top fitting and head shield protection to tank cars. Industry supports an open, transparent, and risk-based review of the appropriate means of containment for the transportation of crude by rail. Some crude products are less volatile than others. Therefore, a risk-based approach will ensure that during the transition phase, the higher risk crude types will be shipped in the higher standard cars as the older legacy cars are transitioned out. This will enable an appropriate time frame for the replacement and/or retrofitting of legacy tank cars and support logistical requirements during the transition period. Industry strongly supports, in terms of preparedness and response, enhancements to emergency response for higher risk dangerous goods, but cautions, as Peter observed, that to date undue focus has been applied to the existing Emergency Response Assistance Program, or ERAP, as being the appropriate delivery mechanism. CAP is of the view that the current local and single shipper importer type ERAP system must be modified in order to enable a more comprehensive national system that can be run by the rail carriers. CAP is currently advancing discussions with the Railway Association of Canada and Canadian Fuels with a view to seeking alignment and presenting a common solution to the government that would see development of a single preparedness and response entity for rail incidents involving flammable hydrocarbons. As an immediate and interim step, a mutual emergency assistance agreement that specifies and streamlines access to available member company resources will be established among CAP, the Railway Association, and Canadian Fuels members. And for the third pillar, liability. Industry supports the polluter pay principle. This is already embedded in many existing liability frameworks. However, gaps within these liability frameworks have recently emerged. While industry is of the view that the current rail liability framework is fundamentally sound, there is a need for more rigorous oversight and better alignment of liabilities to insurance so that all rail companies have the financial and management capability to manage an incident. As design considerations for a rail liability and compensation regime are contemplated, Transport Canada will need to be mindful of implications to carriers and ensure that a risk-based approach is applied to liability requirements. Industry encourages Transport Canada to explore the possibility of creating a hybrid liability model that would leverage attributes from both marine and pipeline models. A hybrid approach would enable smaller, short-line railways to be represented collectively or by a pooled approach, an attribute that's associated with marine model, whereas the larger Class 1 railways can choose a self-insurance approach, an attribute more in line with a pipeline model. In closing, we suggest the committee focus on opportunities for enhancement in the following areas. With regards to safety management systems and safety culture, we suggest leveraging of existing best practices and bodies of research. Over the last 10 years, a number of oil and gas industry organizations, particularly the American Petroleum Institute and the Society of Petroleum Engineers and International Oil and Gas Producers, have published a wealth of information, recommended practices, and guidance on safety management systems, safety culture, and leadership. Regarding additional measures to strengthen the TDG regime, where possible, consideration should be given to the harmonization of TDG regulations with those of the United States Department of Transportation. This would include timelines for phase-outs of legacy tank cars and standardization of sampling and testing procedures for crude classification. Let me conclude with just a few key points. CAP recognizes that the stakeholders and the public are demanding improvements to the safety of transportation of dangerous goods. We want to ensure safe transportation of our products by all means, by pipe, rail, and marine. The safe and responsible production and transport of crude oil is the foundation of our economic well-being, and it is important, and its importance that cannot be overstated. We look forward to the committee's report to facilitate the drive towards performance improvement so as to ensure that oil and gas can be safely moved to markets where it's needed. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. You were all within the time, and that's great. More time for questioning. Now turn it over to Mr. Mai, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, all the witnesses, for being here today. I'll start my question regarding the DOT 111, actually legacy cars or the old DOT 111. We've heard that there are about 80,000 tank cars still in Canada, and I want to know, I heard from the witnesses that we need to have a timeline, realistic timeline. Can anyone here give me what is a realistic timeline? Knowing that, for instance, Irving has said they'll phase them out within 1 year. We had CN said they will phase them out within 4 years. But right now we had a working group look at the DOT 111, and there's still no timeline. So I understand that we are waiting for what's happening in the U.S., but can we here know in Canada, especially after you all know what happened in Lac-Mégantic, Canadians want to know, what is the timeline? Can any one of you give me a realistic timeline?
Who would like to tackle that? Mr. Blaney, you want?
I think we don't have a clear answer to that yet. I think we're looking at a large number of companies that operate lease cars. So I think some of that research is done to help Transport Canada identify what actually is a practical timeline. And I would certainly defer to our witnesses on the teleconference who are more deeply involved in this in terms of if they have any more specific information they could provide.
I would suggest maybe it would be useful to pass it over to our witnesses in Calgary in terms of more specifics, because they're most closely associated with the working group that's been working on this issue.
A couple of points that we would make. There is some work going on to try and understand what would be an appropriate timeline. I think we're looking at somewhere in the 1 to 5 year range, probably closer to 3 or 4. We don't have the data fully in place yet to understand that. As we contemplate this, though, one of the things that we think would be important is to understand the nature of the product that is being shipped and look at a sort of a transitional strategy. A transitional strategy that would target the newer cars that are already in place to the higher risk products that move today.
Yeah, but we've known for 20 years now, and the TSB has been pretty clear on that. We've seen what happened with Lac-Mégantic. The old .111 are problematic. They are considered to be ticking time bombs. And we still today do not have a timeline. I can't understand that. My question to CAP, for instance, I can see that you're making, well, the industry is making about $100 billion of revenues per year. Is that correct?
That's the revenue stream from all of our member companies.
Can you tell me what is a profit of those companies? Ballpark figure.
Well, I can't speak to the specific profit arrangements for all of our companies. Our members are a wide range of different size companies, and they all have different business models that they're working through. So, no, I don't have an answer on that.
You would not know how much the companies that you represent are making in terms of profit? I think they're all basically public companies, right? If you know the amount of revenue, you don't know. Well, all I'm saying is if the revenues are about $100 billion, and let's just make the calculation. We have let's say 80,000, according to a witness that we had here in committee, we have 80,000 cars, all .111, that have to be phased out in Canada. Do you agree that the cost is about $100,000 per car, more or less, for the new ones?
I think that, again, that I'm not that close to the specifics on the car cost estimates. Greg, would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. As you were looking at the new cars that are on order, as you know, I think 80,000 is a number that's much higher than we've seen out there. As we look at kind of the older legacy .11s, there could be a lower number in Canada. Okay. But as you well know, sir, I mean, they're moving across the border back and forth all the time, and so that's why we're looking at that side of things. But your cost estimate for the new cars that we understand are on order are in the range between $100,000 and $150,000.
All right. So let's say we have $150,000. Less than 80,000 cars. We're talking about, what, more or less $80 million in terms of total cost? How much more do we have to, like, how many people have to die in order for us to put the money to make sure that Canadians are safe? And I know it's you won't answer that, but it is very frustrating for us. And I understand that there's a link with the U.S., but I think, especially with our experience, what happened here in Canada, and especially in Lac-Mégantic, I think we have to take some leadership as regulators, as Canadians. We need to work with industry, and that I get it. But if having companies like Irving tell us they can do it within 1 year, and you can't sit down after having a working group to tell us how long it will take. You're talking about 1 to 5 years. And obviously, we lack leadership from the government in terms of telling us, listen, it will take this number of years so that we'll force, we'll make sure that the demand is there, production will be there, and even what we heard from the manufacturers, they say about maybe 4 years if we make them all in Canada. But I mean, if we open the market, whatever, hopefully they would be done in Canada. But if we're talking about moving forward, I still don't understand why all of you working together, having a working group, cannot come up with a timeline.
One of the things I'd like to make clear is that the work that's going on is very, very focused on ensuring and making sure we do have a safe protocol for handling the crude oil that is being handled. And it was noted that there's a variety of different kinds of crude oil, and the ones that are the most volatile are the ones that are needing to have the first access to the modern transport capabilities. And the plans of this working group are very much focused on ensuring a safe transition away from the old, the legacy cars that have actually are safe in service for certain kinds of product, towards the transition to the new cars over, as was spoken to, the shorter period of 3 to 5 years, or 1 to 5 years, or whatever. So the work of that committee has been very much focused on trying to ensure that there will be a safe transition of that product handling.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McGiddy. 7 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Blaney, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. I'm going to go back to the question my colleague asked a second ago. Actually, I'm going to ask the 3 groups here today, starting with Mr. Bogue. Mr. Bogue, what are the gross revenues and approximate net profits of your industry, your group?
I can't tell you that information. We have a mix of public and privately traded companies. Some of them are part of multinational companies that do not produce disaggregated numbers. So,
give us a ballpark.
Yeah, I can't even give you a ballpark, Mr. McGinty.
Really?
Apologies.
You represent a trade association. You can't tell us how much revenue is grossed in your sector?
No,
5 billion, 3 billion?
Okay. It would be more than that, but I can't tell you.
Mr. Blaney, what are the gross revenues and the net profits last year for your membership? You've got those numbers. Your folks in Calgary have those numbers in front of them. They know them off the top of their head.
Well, as I mentioned, the gross revenue picture for our industry is in the range of $100 billion a year. That, as I mentioned, services all our cost structure. It also services a wide range of other things. And similar to Mr. Bogue's response, some of our members are multinational companies that don't report into the Canadian regime, so we actually don't have specific reference to their, quote, profits.
So you don't know. We have to go elsewhere to find out what the net profits are for the companies you represent?
Well, to the extent that it's published public information for some members, it would be available through various means, but we don't collect and monitor that information.
Mr. Marchand?
Yes. Our industry is comprised of producers, retailers. All I can tell you is that we make about a $10 billion impact to the Canadian economy, and we generate about $900 million of revenues and taxes.
But you can't tell me what your gross revenues are by sector or net profits. Okay. Let's move on. Can I go to the question of liability here, joint liability? I asked the railway companies if they're interested in seeing liability for risk shared. We know, and Canadians know, that the railway companies are obliged to carry the materials that your companies produce. Right? They can't refuse them. Right? That's called, it's a free market. It's a fettering of the free market. And if I were a real free marketeer, I would say, well, why can't the railway companies say no? We're not carrying your stuff. There's too much risk. But they have to carry our stuff. They have to carry this material. They have to carry it the way they have to carry it. And they are forced to purchase third-party liability insurance. We don't know how much it is, Mr. Chair, but we know it's approximately $1 billion for CN and $1 billion for CP. Now, both CN and CP are very interested in hearing more about whether your companies, your sectors, are prepared to pay. You're going to share in the liability, not a pooled suggestion, as you've got, Mr. Blaney, in your presentation. But what is the position of CAP, for example, on making sure that, and I don't want to hear about, let's make sure the railways are doing their job, let's make sure it's their responsibility. No, I want to know, is CAP prepared, and are your members prepared to step up and purchase the liability insurance, thereby making sure that your company's regulatory officers and compliance officers are paying very close attention to a couple of things. One, the railway's actual performance. What is happening in these safety management systems? Two, that your members are actually paying attention to what the Auditor General of Canada is saying, because he's the only credible voice in this entire area, in my view. He's the only objective voice. And the scathing indictment of the transportation safety system, rail safety system in the last report is really serious stuff. So can I ask CAP to begin, is CAP prepared to sit down with the railway companies and come up with a joint mechanism, not a pooled resource, where CAP members get third-party liability insurance?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's our view that for the handling of insurance on the major lines, it is something that's most appropriate for the carrier to manage. Now, the reality is that the costs associated with that insurance will be something that flows to the parties that are shipping on that carrier system, because that's something that the costs will flow through.
Sure. And ultimately to the consumer, right? The purchaser of your products is paying for that insurance as well, right?
Well, it comes into the cost structure of transportation.
Sure it does.
But I want to just clarify a little bit about the hybrid argument that I was mentioning. What we're speaking to there is that we recognize that the scale of insurance that you spoke to that applies to the main lines in the order of $1 billion is a fairly heavy load for small rail carriers. And we're looking to try and find a solution for them that would be effective to facilitate their being able to conduct their business and still have access to appropriate fundings to support them, so in the event of an incident. But in the short answer to your question, we still think it sits with the rail carrier to be the party that takes on this insurance, but the cost structure would flow through to the shippers.
So, okay, so the answer is no. That's your answer. That your members are not prepared, and CAP is not prepared, to sit down with the railway companies and negotiate a joint liability arrangement where the owners of the dangerous goods, right, don't get to say, here are the dangerous goods. Now you're responsible for them. And at the back end, when we unload, we'll take responsibility. So that's the answer. I don't want to hear about small pooled funds for the smaller railways. I know you're interested in making sure the railways are protected. I share that concern. But I need to get a clear answer. What is the official position of CAP now? Look, we're going to 1 million barrels a day of surplus capacity in 10 years. If every pipeline plan for this country is built, we're going to have 1 million barrels a day of excess capacity. It's all going to go on rail if it doesn't go on truck. So now's the time, right? We're 10 years out. You've alluded to these massive increases in shipping oil by rail and diluted bitumen by rail. So I just want a really clear answer. Is CAP prepared to participate, to go out to the market and purchase insurance, to share in the insurance? Otherwise, are Canadians supposed to say to the railway companies, you don't have to carry this stuff anymore?
I'm going to actually weigh in with some support from my team in Calgary, because they're much closer to the liability dialogue at the moment. So if I may turn this over to my team.
Sure. Mr. McGinty, I can start on that. I do. Great. Mr. Stringham, the real question to the answer to that is we rely on the rail company to provide the insurance, but we will pay the cost. It does not get transferred to consumers because the price of oil is set in a world market, so it's a cost that comes back to us, but we are willing to contribute to that through our tolls, the same way we do on pipelines. The pipelines take the responsibility, they purchase the insurance, but we end up paying for that, and so the short answer to your question is yes, we are willing to do that, and the best mechanism for us to do that is to do it through those that are transporting it, but to put it into the tolls so that all are covered appropriately, and the accountability for the proper operation remains with the person who is transporting it. But the short answer to that is yes, that's how we do it on the pipelines, that's how we're proposing to do it here, but also supplemented with that fund for the smaller lines who may not be able to go out and purchase adequate insurance.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Stringham. Mr. McGinty's time is up, but if any of you want to have further comments to that particular question, I will allow that. Anyone? Okay, with that, we now move to Mr. Komarnicki, 7 minutes.
Thank you. Just following up on the insurance aspect of it, certainly you're saying the shipper looks after paying the rail company and they look after the insurance, but is there not the potential to augment that? Because my understanding from CNCP is that the insurance might not be sufficient if you had a significant event. So is there some thinking about how you might augment what the rail has for coverage, such as maybe each of the shippers paying into a pooled fund in the event of a big disaster, or doing something as you were suggesting for the short lines, ensuring that there is additional insurance? Mr. Stringham, perhaps, or
Yeah,
Mr.
I'd ask Greg to carry on with his responses, because he, again, is most familiar with this.
Sure, and I can certainly continue on with that. That is the purpose of the hybrid proposal that we have. In our discussion, we believe that the insurance model for the mainline systems can be put in place to be sufficient to be able to handle those types of incidents, and that's our discussion with the rail lines themselves, and that's how it works on the pipelines. But that may not be the case for those that are on the short haul lines or the smaller companies, and thus our hybrid proposal to marry in type of the marine type of funding that is there to put a fund in place that is collectively funded by the shippers to be able to supplement that. But we feel that there's quite a distinction between the mainline systems who can access that insurance market versus the smaller line systems who do not have that ability to do that.
So what you're saying is the main lines are able to get sufficient insurance, in your opinion, but the short lines might not?
I'm not an expert on the insurance, but in our discussions with the operator, the rail lines themselves, they tell us that they are able to access that insurance market on a risk basis that would be sufficient for them to cover it.
Thank you. On another point, I notice when we talk about the propane industry, actually, when you fill up your propane tank at the co-op or some retail outlet, it's interesting to see how the equipment works, and you have specific type of nozzles or fittings and so on. It looks like the industry has developed to take contingencies into account and to ensure that the likelihood of an accident is minimized. Now, as we know, the crude that's being shipped, particularly the Bakken crude, it's evolving, of course. The amount that's being shipped is increasing as we speak. But perhaps the actual design of the rail cars or the fittings or the transfer from trucks to rail has not evolved as sufficiently as it should. Wouldn't it make sense for the increased volume of volatile crude like the Bakken crude to ensure that we have the appropriate rail cars in place and the transfer facilities and equipment to ensure that that the incidence of possible accidents would be lowered?
I can take that one as well if you'd like. The short answer is yes. As much of the growth in the U.S. North Dakota Bakken oil that has gone up on the rail system has been building their loading facilities, and as we look here in Western Canada to loading facilities and unloading facilities in other parts of Canada, clearly the state-of-the-art equipment that's going in for the new facilities should be put in place, and that's what we're looking forward to make sure that's in place. On the evaluation of the tank cars, again, our recommendation is exactly that. The newer tank cars are being built to the higher standard and are coming on service, and all we're suggesting is on a transition basis, take some of the lower volatile, heavier crude oils and use them to transition out into the older cars and clearly put the newer cars being built to the newer standards into the higher volatile service safety mechanisms.
Now, we've heard some figures about what it might cost, but regardless, we're talking 80,000 plus or minus cars at 100 or more thousand per car. We're not talking millions, we're talking billions of dollars. My quick calculation, if I'm right, is in the $10 billion to replace them, and it's probably accurate to say that you're more likely to replace them than retrofit them for a variety of reasons. And if you're going to equip new transload facilities properly, there's going to be a significant cost there as well. We're not talking small millions, we're talking to the billions. How do you propose that cost gets absorbed, and who does it pass on to, and who's ultimately going to be responsible for that cost?
Well, as I explained in the earlier part on the crude oil side of the business, the oil price is set on a world market basis, and it's come back to this. So those facilities will come back out of the net back that goes back to the producer. It's a transportation cost that will be built into the facilities. So as we're building new facilities, of course, it makes sense to use the state-of-the-art ones that are there. And as we're ordering new tank cars, they're being built to the new standard as well. So there is all of the new ones that are coming on for this growth that we anticipate are going to be meeting that new standard. It's really the question of how quickly can we transition the older ones out, and our risk-based approach does allow that to be done in a very safe manner as quickly as we can.
The other aspect that I see is, of course, with respect to the increase of the Bakken crude and the shortage of pipeline capacity, we find that there's truckers bring it to the transload facility to rail, and then off it goes. And I've noted that, at least in my constituency, there have been transload facilities within cities and near schools, and I've often wondered why it is that facilities aren't placed outside a community, like 2 or 3 miles, and is it cost? And from a safety perspective, it would seem like a logical thing to do is keep it out of the cities. And secondly, is there some danger where you have volatile crude in the transload aspect of it, or is the incidence or potential for accidents much lower than it is in the transportation of it?
So I'll take a stab at that. We're not the business that establishes those facilities, but I think we would agree that there needs to be a mechanism to assess the risks associated with those facilities. There's also a mechanism with respect to the safety management, safety culture that we have talked about, that others have talked about as well, that I think should be applicable to the owners and operators of those facilities. There may be merit in looking at the rules for placement of those facilities as well. The committee might want to look at that as well as the other things that the committee is looking at. The other thing that I think Mr. Bogue talked about was the notion of TransCare, which is an information training initiative that CAP has signaled that we intend to be a new participant in. And I think it's important to make sure that anybody in those communities understands what is happening with respect to that business and the products that are being shipped, and certainly any first responders understand what those products are and what risks they pose and what strategies need to be in place to manage for the safe operation and or a safe response in the event of an incident.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Watson. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And after Mr. McGinty's testimony, I was getting worried he might become a free marketer, and then I remembered it was the Liberals who brought in the Canadian Transportation Act, forcing railway companies to carry everything. So I'm not so worried anymore. But welcome to our witnesses. Of course, this is an important review of the transportation safety regime. We're focusing, obviously, both on the transportation of dangerous goods, safety management systems. We are looking at all modes of transport. Ultimately, by the time we report with a final report and recommendations at the end of the year, but we're focusing on rail today. I want to return to the question of DOT 111 cars, the legacy cars, for just a moment. How many DOT 111s do each of your members have? If you don't have that number broken down by company at this particular point among your member companies, I'd like to get that number, or this committee, I think, would like to benefit by having those numbers. Could that be provided to the committee at some point before we conclude the rail mode of transport?
Well, as I would understand it, our members aren't necessarily the owners of all of these vehicles. Some of them are owned by other protocols.
For those of your members who do, then?
Well, I think we can follow up. Greg, do we have estimates on hand as to that? So I think, yes, we can provide estimates, our estimates of what we understand that to be.
Is the strategy of your members to replace or retrofit, or is there a mix among your members about what they do with them?
Well, the approach has been consistent as to wanting to ensure we have a safe transition out to the new car models, and so the process will be, as was discussed, that everyone's buying into the need for the new cars to come on stream and to transition out the use of the old cars and either transform them by retrofit into the higher standard or replace them.
Okay, so it could be both.
Could be both.
Depending on the member company. Fair enough. Transportation Safety Board, in their testimony before this committee, has suggested that the new .111s, which are built to the higher standard and are coming on stream over the last couple of years, first voluntarily, now by way of regulation, are also problematic. Is there a concern or a consideration among your members about whether the new .111s may have to be transitioned out of to a newer standard, and when that will come and how much that will cost?
If I may, I'd like to turn that question back to Greg Stringham and for his background on that, please.
Sure, happy to add to that one. As you know, the new .111s, or as we've been referring to them as the 1232 cars, are the standard that's in place right now that are being ordered, and they're the newer standard. There is some discussion in the United States with the PHMSA for the U.S. government on looking at potentially increasing additional valves and bottom valves on those types of things, but that's in discussion and evaluation right now. What would happen is if that does become a future standard, again, there would be a need for transition, because the ones that are in place right now that are being ordered will have a life of a certain period of time and are deemed and are being looked at right now as being safe. But of course, we always evaluate making sure that this is the safest mode of where it's going, and that's why that is continuing to be evaluated. It's an ongoing discussion. As new, safer equipment becomes in place, then of course the industry looks at that, looks at the retrofitability, and of course the new cars beyond that start being ordered in that mechanism. For example, many of the cars that I know that have been or that are being ordered right now do take into account additional features above the 1232 standard that are available and are being ordered as part of that going forward, but it may not meet the entire scope of issues that are being discussed at PHMSA and with the American Association of Railroads right now.
With propane, obviously, you don't ship by the .111s. You use the .112 or .114 for pressurized TDG transfer. Have there been any concerns raised about those particular cars? Should we be aware of any of that?
No, and those cars came into play in the 80s and 90s with the double wall, with the thermal protection, as well as with the head shields or the significantly thicker heads.
I want to return to the question of liability or joint liability. I had a professor who testified at this committee not long ago that, let me just back up for a second. It was the railway companies who said that they are butting up against a cap, if you will, in their ability to get more insurance out of the marketplace. You're proposing that they take on additional insurance, so clearly there's not agreement about their capacity to take on more insurance. Is your model going to work that you're proposing then, if they're saying they can't get any more insurance out of the marketplace?
Well, our understanding is that the level of insurances that are being talked about in the order of the $1 billion you referenced would be sufficient coverage for the nature of the incidents that could potentially arise as a result of the care and attention being taken to manage the safe transportation of crude oil or other dangerous goods. The exposure to that level of liability coverage would seem unlikely, because I don't believe, apart from Megantic, which was a very unfortunate and very unique situation, there hasn't been situations arise prior that have tested or gone beyond the liability coverage arrangements.
In the marine mode of transport, can they refuse to ship dangerous goods?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. Greg, do you have an answer to that question?
I can add to that. From that perspective, it is commercial. It is not a common carrier. The closest model to that will be the pipeline model, where they do take the oil as it's given to them as well. But on the marine side, it's a commercial side of things, and of course there's the similar types of things for inspecting the vehicles, the ships before they come in, as you would on the rail car side of things as well. I could just go back and add to Bob's.
Well, the question, you have shared liability in marine. Why wouldn't you accept joint liability? When I should say crude oil has shared liability in marine. Hazardous substances outside of crude will soon have that. Why not joint liability when it comes to rail?
So I can add to that. On the marine side of things, as you know, the ships carry their own liability for shipping insurance. They do have a limit to that, and that's where the fund comes in that we can draw on from this perspective. Very similar to the hybrid model that we're proposing on the rail side of things, where the capability is held by the shipper or by the rail company. I just want to answer again to Bob's question on the you had on the.
You're proposing that rail companies assume all of the risk. You're not proposing joint liability. Pooled risk for rail
the hybrid
companies,
model,
but not pooled risk for the shippers.
Okay, let Mr. Stringham or.
Yeah, so I'll just conclude that what we're proposing is the hybrid model, that we believe that the insurance model is sufficient for the main line, but not for the smaller companies. And as we look at that insurance model, I want to come back and say there's only a certain amount of insurance that can be acquired jointly, whether it be by us or whether it be by the rail company. It's not like you can take what they can get up to their limits and then say, well, the insurance model is big enough that you can actually add on that from others. The liability is really captured by a global insurance market that whoever buys into that market will be assessing the risk associated with that.
Okay, thank you. And I'll move to Ms. Moran, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en
Thank you very much. I will be speaking in French, so if you need to put in your earpieces, please do. I'm going to follow up on what my colleague said. Mr. Stringham, you compared the model of rail transport to the pipeline model, but there are there's a fund for indemnation, compensation in the case of spills to ensure that taxpayers will not foot the bill. Mr. Blaney, a bit earlier, you said that apart from the unusual situation of Lac Mégantic, but, you know, that did happen. That was a real thing that happened last summer. I think we should, and in that case, the rail transportation companies could not pay for it. There were millions of dollars in donations. Canada paid $95 million, Quebec paid $95 million, so that's $190 million paid by taxpayers. So that means that our taxes are funding this because there was this accident and the insurance company, and, well, MMA said that the insurance company could not cover those costs. So currently the model does not work. We have the proof. Taxpayers had to pay for the cleanup of the lake, for waste elimination, for paying the families, and so on and so on. The taxpayers paid for that. These are your products, and the model is not working. Now, Mr. Stringham, you're saying that, well, because you pay the railways, it's as though you're paying for the insurance. But we have the proof from last summer that this model is not working. As Mr. Watson was saying, a professor came to speak to the committee, and he suggested that you could also play a more active role in the insurance process. So what concrete measures would you propose so that incidents like Lac Mégantic do not happen again? Because you're saying, well, it's as though we're paying the insurance, but that really wasn't the case. So if there is another accident like Lac Mégantic, because certainly it could still happen, the .111 cars are still in use. So in that case, what will happen? Will it be the Quebec and Canadian governments who will have to pay? Will it be the taxpayers who will have to pay for this accident, which private companies are responsible for? Mr. Stringham, and then Mr. Blaney can answer that one.
At his end, but I can approach the answer from the standpoint that what we're talking about with regard to the hybrid model that was discussed is exactly to ensure that we cover the small rail lines with adequate form of liability coverage. And the reason for the need for that is that the smallest rail transporters don't have the capacity to access the larger market for the sake of coverage on liability. So that's why we've proposed a hybrid model that would facilitate them being able to take out whatever insurances they can, which again is something that ends up being paid for by the shipper, and then they can supplement that with pooled resources to find a way to...
Can you tell us exactly what this hybrid model would consist of? in this hybrid model, who would be responsible for what?
The way that would work, and I'll ask Greg to weigh in on this as well, is that there would be, for the sake of the smaller rail transportation companies who can't access large amounts of liability coverage in the same way that the mainline carriers can, that they would be supplemented in their access to funds by way of pooled funds that would be available in the event that there was an incident and they exhausted the level of insurances that they would otherwise have. They would have access to additional funds that would be available to facilitate and clean up and address the incident that was in play. Greg, do you want to elaborate on that any further?
Ces fonds supplémentaires proviennent de où exactement?
And where does this additional funding come from? Is it the compensation fund?
Greg?
So I would just add, when we're looking at this, the insurance model on the main lines and the hybrid model of having a pooled fund on the small lines is designed specifically to address the question that you've just raised. The funds for the pooled funds that would be there would come from the shippers that are shipping oil on those smaller lines. And it would be very similar to the best attributes of the pipeline model for the main lines and the best attributes of the marine model that allows that fund to be there for the smaller lines, where there has been an incident and other incidents where the insurance model itself is insufficient. So that's exactly why we've designed it, and it would be paid for by the shippers of oil on those lines.
Si je comprends bien, dans ce modèle-là, les propriétaires...
Ms. Moran. Ms. Young, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. Just to follow up on Ms. Moran's question and to be absolutely clear, I guess that unless I missed something, it's not CAP or your group of association members that are going to be responsible or going to pitch in for this pooled fund, but it's primarily you're looking at the shippers or the, transporters to do that. Is that correct?
Well, the answer is that the shippers are our members in many cases, so it would include shippers of our membership that would be participating in this pooled fund arrangement.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's not just the owners of the... See, there's this confusion, I guess, for me anyway, where we have the Canadian Association and all of you good people, but then there are the people that own the trains, like CNN, CP, et cetera, et cetera. So who's going to pay into this fund, if you can be very, very clear about that?
Well, again, as I understand the model, it would end up with, in the case where there was needing to be pooled funds in excess of the liability coverage that would be otherwise available to the rail carrier, that funding would be supported by the shippers. And in the case of our industry, the shippers tend to be our producing companies. So our members would be involved with supporting that pool. There may be other parties that are involved with shipping of crude oil as well, and they'd have the same responsibility.
And how would you come to sort of some kind of formula as to who's going to do what? Because, you're fairly large. There are all these moving components in terms of who has pieces of shipping oil and gas and propane.
Well, as to oil and gas, I'll again turn that question back to Greg, because I think he'd be most familiar with the specifics of the intent of the modeling, but I would assume it's going to be volume-based. But Greg?
Yeah, I can add to that, Ms. Young. As we look at this, we're really trying to take the best of the operations of what's happening on the marine model that's already well established. And again, it is $1 per volume, so $1 per barrel, $1 per gallon, whatever it is, that is put into that fund that is established then by those that are moving that product. And so that's what it would be doing, is take what's really working on the marine side up to the level that needs to be collected, as it was, and it's been sitting there now collected on the marine side for many, many years. But that's the kind of model we're proposing.
Okay, now it makes a lot more sense. Thank you, and thank you for clarifying that. That was very helpful. So basically you're saying that there will be a formula in place for everyone that is moving this product, and that will be based on the amount of product being moved, and therefore, everyone's going to contribute to this fund, which will then build very similar to the Marine Fund, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Fabulous. then that clarifies that. What I wanted to ask you about is your going back to the recommendations, which appears very, very similarly, in fact, the same in all of your presentations. So on the one hand, I think that that's admirable because obviously you've done a tremendous amount of work in working together to come up with these recommendations. However, I wanted to talk about the gaps within the liability frameworks. Do you believe that this pooled fund then will address all the gaps that you've identified, or are there other gaps that you've identified that you would like to speak to today?
From my perspective, I believe that the approach we're taking is intended to cover those gaps. That's exactly why it's being set up. The gap that we witnessed with the Megantic incident was one where there wasn't sufficient funding available for a small rail carrier, and that's why this particular model is being proposed explicitly to deal with that.
So there are no other gaps that you've identified in all of your good work over all these past months that you feel need to be identified and or a solution for today?
Well, I'm not aware of any more, but I'll just reconsult with Greg and or Dave to see if there's anything else they'd be aware of.
Perhaps not truly in the definition of liability, but we've talked, Mr. Bogue and Mr. Blaney have talked about us working together with the Railway Association to come up with a national scope emergency response mechanism, and that will certainly need to have a funding mechanism associated with this. We would see that that would be a jointly designed, jointly funded mechanism. We think the Railway Association will know if there's an incident is best in place to call down any response, but we believe that there's a joint initiative required to close the gap around how everybody works together in a response. It was evident, I think, in Lac Megantic that there was a need, as a result of that, need for better coordination around that. Our industry's East Coast Response Organization actually was responding to that, and it was clear that there needed to be some better governance in how everybody worked together in that space. So we've made recommendations around that. I think the working group that the minister set in place made similar recommendations, and we are in discussions as the three associations in how best to pursue that going forward.
Okay, thank you. Your time has expired. Mr. Mai, 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Correcting, not me directly, but yeah, what I said, I agree that it was it's more than 80 million. As I was talking, we're talking more in the billions. But when we look at, if we would have done that 20 years ago, again, I talk about .111, when we first knew that there was a problem. If you amortize it, it's worth saving lives. But I'll come back to, we were talking, on parlait justement du fonds d'indemnisation.
We were talking about the compensation fund, and I wanted to know, when it comes to pooled funds, does that result from government directives, or did the industry decide, well, we saw what happened in Lac Mégantic, and this is what we're proposing to protect taxpayers? Does this come from the government or from the industry?
In English, as to whether this was being government-driven or whether it was being industry-proposed. The proposal we've offered, or we're building for the hybrid model and for the handling of small rail, is an industry proposal.
Okay. Puis c'est ce qu'on voit au niveau de la déréglementation, justement. Puis j'entends aussi.
Okay, I've heard the Liberals say, well, it's up to the rail companies, it's up to the industry to come up with rules or regulations to regulate this. And we've seen this attitude from the Liberals and the Conservatives. They're letting the industry regulate itself. So they're trying to do better than the regulations that currently exist. And for the .111 cars, companies are showing more leadership in terms of regulation, in terms of public protection, than the government, who is supposedly there to protect Canadians. So I congratulate you for that. And I would like to know, is there a plan, and would it be possible to table the plan with the committee? Because I thought your proposition was very interesting, and I would like to have more information on that plan. Is that something that you could table with the committee?
has proposed is whether we're in a position to table a plan with the committee. That's work that's in progress with the working groups at this point in time, and my understanding of that is it will come forward into the public domain in due course. But again, I'll defer to my experts in Calgary on the specifics of that, if I may.
Sure. As we've been looking at this plan, again, we want to be very clear to answer your question that this is something we're proposing that become part of the regulation overall, so it applies to everyone.
Yeah.
And so from that perspective, we will be putting the details of that plan down, but you've seen the details here, and we are now working with Transport Canada and with our colleagues in the other associations to make sure we flesh out the details of the plan so that it can be fully presented.
And I think the other point I would make is that the government has been talking to industry on the broad range of transportation, and so they have been looking to establish the regulatory requirements within marine and within pipeline, and our engagement in those discussions has enabled us to give some thought to and evidently bring forward this notion of a hybrid model.
Thank you very much. Question pour justement l'association.
I have a question for the Propane Association. Have there been any large accidents? I know we're not dealing with the same type of cars, but has there been an increase? If we compare this to crude oil, there were 500 wagons and cars in 2009 compared to 165,000 in 2013. So has there been a change?
Propane Association and the Canadian Fuel Association were all part of the Emergency Response Assistance Plan Working Group that submitted report and recommendations to the Minister of Transport on January 31st, 2014. But the report cited, and I'll quote, lack of available data on dangerous goods movement and emergency response resources as a serious constraint in developing its recommendations. Can you tell us what type of data was missing in terms of dangerous good movement in order to make sure that we have a ERAP?
I would actually defer to those who actually participated directly in the working group, and we have some of those on video conference from Calgary right now.
I think that's you, Brian.
It's Brian Hearn with the Canadian Fuels Association. I was part of the working group, at least on the fuel side, and in the short time period we had on the working group side, we were trying to collect the data on movements, particularly around municipalities, etc. So it was recognized that before the January 31st deadline that we weren't able to pull together that data, and part of the working group report was a follow-up to collect that data to get a more robust view of the numbers on the TDG railcar movements for both fuels and crudes.
Okay. Anyone else want to add to that? Mr. Price? Or Price, I should say.
I believe the one of the constituents, the fire chiefs, was looking to see some more precise data in terms of volumes of product or different products that would be moving through municipalities, and I don't think the committee had that knowledge, and so was accepting the fire chief's desire to get that information and making that recommendation.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'll move to Mr. Tote, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for everybody being here today. We've talked quite a bit about some of the gaps in liability. Talked about that a lot. Gaps in some of the response mechanisms and response issues. I want to try and move that a little bit, that conversation, to the actual movement of goods, dangerous goods, safely in Canada. I think a large part of what we're working through on this committee and what we're trying to aim for is to not see a repeat of any of these incidents such as Lac-Mégantic. We do not want to see that again. So yes, we need to talk about the responses and the liabilities, if these incidents do arise. But I think the bigger picture that we're really wanting to see here is how do we make sure this does not happen again? And in light of that, I just wanted to speak to, I know the Propane Association, you specifically talked about in your notes here that there's safety requirements being consistently applied to different types of transfers, which is not currently the case. So you believe there's a gap there. Can you speak to that?
We do believe, yeah. When you transfer from rail to fixed storage, that falls under provincial regulations, and there are strict regulations governing the use of safety valves, protective barriers, informing the municipality, getting permission from the municipality to carry out these operations. And in Ontario, you even have to do a risk assessment, which takes into account residential, schools, hospitals, etc. However, if it's unloaded from a rail car into a mobile truck or transport, the provincial regulations do not apply. So you don't have the same level of safety with the emergency shutdown type valves. You don't have the zoning requirements to meet, all of those things. So we believe that there's a gap there.
So would you
and I think it's similar to what the other member talked about, these transloading facilities and putting them into, near cities, etc.
Right. Would you be able to give us a written documentation on that, exactly where you see those gaps, what the regulations are, and what the difference in those regulations are, like you said, when you're going from a rail car to a truck now, which is different than some of the other facilities? Because I think that's very important for us to be looking at. And I would appreciate receiving that information.
We can do that and compare fixed storage versus mobile storage.
Okay. And Cap, is there anything in CFA that you've also seen in the loading, the transloading, the unloading, anything that we need to be looking at to make sure that we're doing this in the safest manner possible? Are you looking at those kind of things to see if there's, have you looked at them? And will you be looking at them if there's any gaps that need to be addressed in that?
Again, Greg touched on that briefly, but I'll let him follow on with a response, a more fulsome response to that. Greg?
Well, maybe I'll speak to that, Bob Dave Price.
Dave.
That's fine. That's fine. The transloading business is actually not directly part of CAP membership, so I can't speak to that with any knowledge. I would think there's merit in looking into that per our Propane Association comments. There is always a question when you have two different jurisdictions, whether or not there's consistency in approach. So I think there's probably a worthiness in looking into that.
Well, and I would assume, Mr. Price, that your industry would be very concerned about making sure that the goods that you're moving are moved in a safe fashion. That you're not just, as had been alluded to before, that you're not just handing these off and saying now it's your problem. You want to make sure that those goods, I would assume, are moving in the safest manner possible. So you'd actually want to be part of that process of looking at how are they loading and unloading our goods.
Absolutely, and I think we'll look into this per your request. I think our members, with their contractual arrangements with the transshippers, would have sort of contractual arrangements with respect to the safety requirements. We will look into that.
The other thing I wanted to touch on, Mr. Bogue, you had, in your opening comments, had talked about you support the upgrade of the .111s, but you talked about replacement and retrofitting. From what we've understood from the testimony we've had during this committee hearings on this, do you believe that retrofitting really is an option on this at all?
I think that will ultimately fall to individual tank car owners as to what they see as the most effective and efficient way to deal with the higher levels of safety required under the new DOT 111 standards. I'm not a tank car expert, so I'm not about to get into the granularity of on this car whether it's better to retrofit or this car is better to replace. But I would suspect that replacement is probably going to be the much more significant strategy than retrofit.
Okay, your time has expired. We'll now move to Mr. Braid, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you to our panel for being here this morning. A question, my first question for both Mr. Bogue and Mr. Blaney, for each of your associations. As you know, before crude is shipped by rail, Transport Canada requires that it be tested for its level of volatility. And there's been some concern about the underreporting of the level of volatility of types of crude. Twofold question. One, could you comment on that? Two, what, if anything, are your respective associations doing to ensure the integrity of that testing and reporting?
I'll start and then again defer to those who are directly involved in this activity. But certainly in the working groups that were established, by Minister Raitt, back in late mid-November, there were three. One was to look into the DOT 11 tank cars. One was to look into emergency response capability, and the third was actually to look into the whole issue of the testing and classification of crude. So we, as associations, probably more from the CAP side than us on the fuel side, have been directly involved and significantly involved in that ongoing activity with respect to assuring that the testing and classification of crude is done appropriately and adequately to address the levels of safety that are required. And with that, probably defer to Dave. You're the one who's probably been most directly involved in that.
Yes, thank you. That working group did identify a couple of needs. One is to make sure that the testing was happening at the appropriate transfer points, and I think there's merit in having a mechanism from a regulatory perspective to affirm that. The minister did in her, I think it was Emergency Order 31 back in July, direct all of the industry to retest all of the product that they were moving, just to confirm that we had a good understanding of that. As the working group undertook and did its business, it was determined that the methodology for testing was in need of enhancement. Concern about representativeness of the volatility was actually the key point. So we have committed to working with the Crude Quality Association in Canada and the department to look at and develop a new in-field test for that process. And that was part of the recommendation that was made in the report.
Thank you. Moving on, Mr. Blaney, in your presentation, you indicate that while industry is of the view that the current rail liability framework is fundamentally sound, there's a need for more rigorous oversight and better alignment of liabilities to insurance in order to ensure that all rail companies have the financial and the management capability to manage an incident. I think we've probably sufficiently covered the financial aspect of this, but what do you mean by ensuring that rail companies have the management capability to manage an incident?
That partly relates to what I think was being talked about in terms of the emergency response abilities and the organizational ability to respond to an incident. We've been promoting that it be, again, a rail carrier's lead in terms of organizing that arrangement to be able to be responsive, and that's what we're talking about in terms of management capability.
And Mr. Byte, in your presentation, your conclusion, you indicate the CPA supports the harmonization of TDG's regulations between the U.S. and Canada. Significant amounts of propane move between the two countries. Why is harmonization so important?
Just because there are significant amounts of propane moving back and forth, and there's slight variations in regulations, the paperwork associated with it, the documentation associated with it, and we could be more efficient and be more consistent.
Okay. How much time do I have left?
You have 30 seconds or a little more.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Mai, 5 minutes.
I'll give my
time to sorry, Mr. Blanchette, welcome to the committee. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here. In Quebec, we have a refinery. And the company started dramatically increasing its use of railways. Now, a few minutes ago, I heard something that really surprised me, and I'm being polite when I say I was surprised. I heard that firefighters did not have the information necessary when there was a fire there. So that means that people in communities all across the country, in those communities, firefighters responding to emergencies do not have the information that they need. And in a context where we're transporting products that are more and more volatile, there's more and more risk. The risk has increased dramatically in the last few years. It's not a stable situation as existed when we were transporting traditional oil. So there's been a significant increase in risk, and it seems to me that we still haven't implemented the necessary measures to inform the people who are responsible for responding to emergencies. In some places, these people are being paid, and in other places, these people are volunteers. So we need to help them. First of all, I don't understand why they don't have this information, and secondly, I'm wondering what the federal government could do to help you disseminate this information as rapidly as possible. Now, providing these people with information is not an option, it's a moral obligation.
Clearly, one of the gaps that's been identified in this process to date is the need to provide more and better information, to first responders, and that's part and parcel of an overall enhancement of the emergency response process. That's been a key part of the ongoing examinations within transport, within industry, and a collective examination by stakeholders. So certainly, the expansion of the emergency response assistance program, and in our view, in the context of a single entity responder, will directly address some of that. In addition, in terms of the additional information, I think you heard me refer to at the beginning of an existing program, TransCare, that has largely been established and run by the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada and the transport for the transport of their products, which are considered dangerous goods. And we see that as an excellent model that we're now examining, and how then we can use and piggyback on an established and proven system, that is designed directly to provide, first responders and communities across the country with much better information in order to make their job more effective and efficient.
À quel moment?
When will your members commit to providing all of the necessary information to first responders everywhere that trains go through? When will they be able to have this information and be able to know the best way of responding?
Today, and it's a question of how can we do that faster, how can we do it better, and how can we provide, as you say, all of those people who need to know the information in an effective, in an efficient, and a timely way. And that's a process that we're doing right now, and how we can continue to build on that.
Okay. Bon, regardez là.
Well, listen. I know that it takes time to do some of these things, but at the same time, the government is going to be forced to intervene at some point to enforce these emergency measures. As my colleague said, it shouldn't be up to taxpayers to pay for accidents caused by private companies. So there is a risk, and taxpayers have already paid a high price for the damages caused by the industry. Now, I'll give you another opportunity to tell me how the government can help you better regulate this. Will the government have to regulate things, impose standards, or are you ready to pick up the pace to provide this information more quickly? I mean, do we need to have the threat of harsher regulation, or are we going to wait until there's another catastrophe?
There to be another catastrophe. I think the key point of much of the discussion and the engagement that's been going on over the last months has been directly to address that. So I think yes, there's a role for regulation. Yes, there's a role for voluntary action on industry, and I think in Canada we have a pretty good system to do that. We're responding to those challenges now. Dave, did I see you wanted some additional comments there?
Sure. Right now, we are engaged directly with the Firefighters Association as CAP and CFA and the Rail Association to pull together the necessary information. Canutech, an organization in Ottawa, also provides the information around the products that are being moved, the MSDSs. What I think the gap is understanding the implications of what the MSDS sheets say, material safety data sheets say, and how the firefighters or any first responders should interpret that data to understand how best to approach an incident in action. And so the other piece that we've said we are going to do, and other organizations are doing, is participate in TransCare, which directly puts us in the field with the first responders and providing our information through an educational system there. So we're looking to enhance that. Any coordination around that the government chooses to impose would not be a concern for us. The minister has put an emergency order or directive in place that requires the rail companies to advise municipalities now of the nature of the product that is moving through these systems. So there are a number of things that are in play. I think an overarching governance of that would be significant in improving the circumstance of the situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. McGinty, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, I want to go back to the question of shipping oil by rail. Shipments of Canadian crude have reached 175,000 barrels per day, compared with just under 24,000 barrels per day at the start of 2012. Right? From 24,000 in 2012 to 175,000 barrels today. Private equity is weighing in heavily. Right? Calgary-based Torque has got $250 million invested in private equity from Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. Kinder Morgan is working with Imperial Oil now to build a $170 million facility to ship crude out of Edmonton, going to 250,000 barrels a day. Enbridge did a deal last year with Tundra Energy Marketing, building a 60,000 barrel per day terminal near Cromer, Manitoba. U.S. Valero, operator Valero, began operating a 50,000 barrel per day rail terminal at its Quebec refinery, taking in Bakken and Canadian crude. And it goes on and on and on. There's a gold rush, but it's an oil rush, shipping oil by rail. Now, I want to ask the two colleagues from CAP, the two gentlemen from CAP, Mr. Price and Mr. Stringham, when your sector and your organization and your members talk about social license, obtaining a social license to operate their companies, what does that mean?
So from Mr. Stringham, from my perspective, as we take a look at what's happening to the development of the oil and gas industry, you cited several of the proposed loading terminals on rail, and rail is becoming a larger portion of our sector. But, I mean, you've got to put that in the context that we are actually moving about, for Canada today, about 3.2 million barrels a day of oil.
Right. So what does social license mean? When your member, when Exxon, when Suncor, when any other corporate member of your group gets up and talks, your CEOs, Mr. Mulroney spoke about it the other night. What does it mean when you say you operate under the social license? What does that mean in plain English?
In plain English, I think as we look at the social license that the industry needs to have in order to develop the Canadian resources, it means two main things. One, is it being done in an environmentally and responsible and safe manner? And two, what are the benefits that are accruing to Canada, to governments, and to the individuals as part of that development so that Canadians see the development of that?
Okay, let me just explore that with you. My view of social license is simpler. Your company's abilities to operate are granted by Canadian citizens. Not by any order of regulation, not any regulator, but your ability to operate, all of you here today, is granted by the Canadian people. So, in that sense, I want to ask you about the Auditor General's report. Because, as I said earlier, the only credible objective analysis of what's going on in rail safety and SMSs done by any group, not by any trade association, not by Transport Canada. The only credible analysis was done with the Auditor General. So let me ask you, Mr. Stringham, and Mr. Price, particularly you as the VP of Operations. In terms of your members' responsibilities to maintain and keep their social license, that is, the permission of the Canadian people to do what you're doing, your members are doing, have you examined the Auditor General's findings and report in detail, Mr. Price?
I have not.
You have not. Have your members looked at the Auditor General's report in detail?
I would expect they have, or at least in part.
So CAT
Some
has
of them.
not been briefing boards of directors, compliance officers, risk mitigators, risk managers. They're not aware of the scathing 10, 12, 15 conclusions of the Auditor General?
I would say that we've paid attention to what the discussion has been with respect to rail, whether it's the Auditor General or whether it's the Department of Transportation and the working groups that they have put in place that we have been participating on to address the issues that we've seen come forward.
Do you think as a condition of keeping the social license you've now got granted to you by the Canadian people that you ought to be paying closer attention, for example, to the number one conclusion of the Auditor General, which is that Transport Canada can't tell us whether there's a proper SMS system in play right now? That's his number one conclusion.
So I'm not understanding where you're going with the question, but we certainly believe that there should be appropriate safety management systems in place. We do use those within our own business. We have looked at safety both from a safety management system perspective. We looked at it from a safety process perspective. We also believe that safety culture is the approach to take it.
No, you're out of time.
I'm out of time. That's too bad. Maybe the witnesses will come back, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Go ahead and finish, Mr. Price.
I was just saying that we look at safety culture as probably the best opportunity to enhance the safety performance, regardless of an industry. It's more than just documenting safety and safety performance. It's trying to embed the safety culture in the business, from the CEO all the way down to the individual who is operating a valve or operating a train system or whatever.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Komarnicki. 5 minutes.
Just carrying on from where I left off, and I get the feeling that you say we want to ship the petroleum product, the crude oil, the Bakken crude, and we leave it up to the rail company to be concerned about how it gets there, how safe it is, and the liability is theirs. And we don't share in that liability, and I'm wondering if perhaps shippers shouldn't share in that liability to make you more interested. For instance, in the transload facilities that I had asked about previously, do you know what the risk and safety proportionality is, or comparability between what the incidents might be at the point of at a point of a transloading facility versus actual rail transport by cars on rail? Have you done any assessments on that? Mr. Stringham or Mr. Price? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can start at that. As we take a look at the full value, kind of the full chain from the production of facilities all the way down to when it ends up in the market itself, the safety incidents that happen along the way, we've looked at them generally but not specifically. Wherever there is a transfer point, there is an additional need for assessment of what's going on there, but also it's in the operation of facilities along the way. But the transport points themselves do add another element of safety and risk that is being looked at along the full value chain, from when we produce it all the way till it gets actually to the end consumer.
And don't get me wrong, of course we want to be able to transport the Bakken crude to market, that's for sure. But I understand there's going to be an exponential increase of transloads facilities. And what I find remarkable is that you would have a transload facility in a city without having made the assessment if it's safe there, if it's operating safely, whether they have the capability to deal with it. It would seem to me more logical that before you expand transload facilities, before you actually start utilizing the facilities, that all of this work would be done in advance. Why hasn't it been so by your members?
Yeah, so when our members are looking at the transportation of this, they rely on the transportation companies to put it in the locations that are most appropriate. Again, as Mr. Price said earlier, we believe that those need to be assessed and looked at if they are being done in places that are higher risk. Most of the facilities where our transload and our members are being built are at the very front end, when it's transferred first from their production facilities into the transporter, whether that be a pipeline or whether that be a rail or whether that be a truck. Those happen out in the rural areas where the production is mostly coming on. From there, it travels, as you know, through rail, through truck in some cases, but through pipeline through a number of other locations. And each one of those points needs to be assessed by the transporter according to the regulations that are in place, and with this additional eye on risks to minimize the risk. In my mind, as we look at this, we're going to have to look at both pipeline and rail as we move forward, because pipeline continues to be a big part of this development as well.
Well, fair enough, but I heard you say earlier, we should be testing the volatility of the crude that's being placed in this tank. Maybe we haven't got there, but we've already been transloading that. So how is it that your members who are transporting your product haven't done that homework in advance to be sure when you actually start using it that all of these points have already been covered as opposed to down the road?
Yeah, and I want to be very clear that all of the points on the current safety regime are being covered. What we're suggesting is there needs to be enhancements to that to make sure we prevent any future incidents and can get to the maximum amount of safety that can be there. But that's not to say there's nothing there now. Clearly, the testing is there now, the regulations on where the locations can be there right now, and the safety of transportation, whether that be by rail or pipeline, are all in place right now through the operations and through the regulations that are there.
And when you come to a smaller community and you're looking with an emergency response assistance plan, especially in these transload facilities, you're dealing with communities that may not have the capability or the capacity. Has your association or your membership looked at making sure that there is a provision for that capacity to these smaller communities if you're going to place the facilities there?
So in Western Canada, we have an entity called Western Canada Spill Response, and that is an organization that is jointly funded by the producers. In fact, there's mandatory requirements to participate in that or have separate response capabilities by the regulators in Western Canada. That's an entity that is positioned to respond to any incident that might occur, and they do routine exercises or testing with the companies and with the regulators in different scenarios in those communities.
And back to the question I had about the cost, which I estimated in the billions of dollars, whether it's 10 or 12 billions, and wondered, how those costs get absorbed and how they get passed on. And if I understood you correctly, you're basically saying it's a market thing, and it's going to be built into whether it's economical for you to transport that way. But might the cost of replacing these DOT 111 cars or increasing the capacity of the transload facilities mean that the cost would be such that other means would be considered than rail?
Well, as I said originally on that, I mean, right now, about 95% of the product that we move on the oil side actually is moving by pipeline. Rail is relatively new, and as we look at new pipelines across Canada and into our key markets, that will continue to be the main form. Rail is going into different areas right now, and so it's one that's growing, but clearly we need to do that and make sure that it's done in a safe manner. But from the cost perspective, as I want to be very clear on this one, with the world oil price being set by the dynamics of the world, any costs that come out of that do come back out of the cost that the producer pays and the total amount of revenue that comes back from that perspective. So it's not like it's being put onto consumers or it's actually being absorbed by the rail companies or others. It's put into the tolls that we end up paying.
So, actually, your time is up, Mr. Kormanicki, so I have to pass it over to Mr. Watson. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And just to clarify for the public record, for those who may be watching, the question about what information municipalities have had or now have in the event of an incident they've always had, and every responding organization would have known that they had 24/7 access to CanUtech, who have the manifests, copies of manifests, so that in the event of an incident they knew what they were dealing with. What the gap was that Protective Direction 32 addresses was the concern of the Association of Fire Chiefs. Why they wanted the historical data was so that they could pre-plan their training and ensure that if they could pre-position or have the means of combating different source fire in the event of an accident. That was recognized by the regulator, obviously Transport Canada, the AFC, and as well as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who hailed Protective Direction 32. That essentially, for anybody who's read it, I've got a copy in front of me, not only provides the historical info to a designated community emergency planning official, but the obligation that any significant change must be made or notified ASAP, and it provides a system for a system of notification. That is, there's a designated emergency planning official and a registry of those officials as the means of communicating that information now. So we think that that's a step forward. We agree with FCM in that regard, and I think they're pleased with that. I want to turn my attention for a moment, if I could. In terms of the testing and classification, Bakken obviously has different volatility, more volatility, if you will, than, say, diluted bitumen. Do witnesses here today feel that Bakken is inherently more dangerous than the latter when it comes to rail shipments? And secondly, is there value in classifying differently those elements?
Well, I can start with this question, and I'm going to pass it on as well to Dave. But a quick answer, yes, the Bakken crude demonstrates more volatile characteristics. It has higher light ends in its crude mix. But that's exactly why the testing procedures are being looked at very carefully to ensure that that's being properly monitored. But I'd pass this on to Dave to expand on that further, if you like.
Yeah, and briefly as possible, please.
Sure, thanks, Bob. And yes, we do believe that there is a difference in terms of the volatility, and therefore they should be looked at and managed differently. That's why there are a variety of packing groups that Transport Canada rules have, and so looking at that and applying the higher higher standard packing group to those higher volatility crudes to us is an appropriate management measure.
Following the TSB's recommendation in light of Lac-Mégantic, the minister obviously has, with a working group, has been looking at emergency response assistance plans being developed for crude oils. A, do you support the initiative? Secondly, do you think that a single ERAP would sufficiently cover the range of products commonly referred to as crude oils, or that multiple plans should be developed based on the chemical characteristics of the shipment?
I think our perspective is that...
Directly to Dave again, the quick answer is that we believe a broader plan can cover all crude quality issues in terms of response planning. Dave?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's important to make sure that there's knowledge of the variety of products that that exists out there that are being moved. We think a sort of consolidated ERAP and/or emergency response system is probably more robust and more effective to manage the movement of crudes, and that's why we've been engaged with the different associations.
Actually, I think, Mr. Blaney, this was your proposal in your presentation today, this national system run by the carriers. I have some questions about what that means. Are we talking about coordinating the coordination of the shipper and railway company resources within regions to respond to a particular incident? Are we talking about a shift from the shipper through ERAPs and their resources and expertise to the railway company? What are we talking about by this national system, and who's doing what?
That's actually what Dave was, I think, can further respond to as well. But it is an intent to have the carrier, who is most familiar with the operations of his system, be coordinating or leading the overall response plan. But the plan would draw on all of the resources that are available to administer potential incidents. So, Dave, again, would you want to expand on that, please?
Thanks, Bob. And we are in dialogue with the Rail Association, Canadian Fuels, and would entertain whoever else has to be part of that to set up a national system that the governance would still need to be defined. But I think everybody has a role and a responsibility in the design, funding, and operation of it. The point about the carriers is they're the ones that will first know if there's an incident, so we believe it is best suited for them to call down any response on that basis. But we're talking about a jointly participated, managed coalition of the existing functions, but probably needing to enhance that beyond what exists today.
Okay,
companies provide to that
sorry,
system.
Mr. Watson, your time has expired. We just have a few minutes left, and I'm going to allow Mr. Mai and Ms. Young one brief question each, leaving a minute for the response.
Parfait. Juste rapidement.
Great, thank you. The Union of Municipalities of Quebec requested that we implement measures to reduce the speeds of trains going through urban areas. Do you agree with that? I know that we did ask this question to rail companies, but on your side, do you have any hesitation about that, or do you support that idea?
Greg, could you please quickly respond to that?
Go ahead. Yes, we think it's important to not only look at what the product is and what the cars are, we also think it's important to look at the operational practices of the railway company. So speeds, routing, and all that sort of thing, we think should be part of the consideration.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Young, a brief question.
Just on Tuesday, we had the rail companies here in front of us, and my question then is that just as we're doing future planning for the new DOT 111s, are you thinking of doing or participating in or leading even future planning for urban planning? Because as you know, many communities have grown around the railroads. Many of your transload facilities are actually in cities or in places where they possibly shouldn't be. Is there an overall assessment being done across the country of moving those facilities or thinking or working with cities to urban plan around maybe they shouldn't be where they are for safety? And so I just want to put that on the table.
Sure. Through the emergency response planning initiative or the ERAPs that we talked about, we think that would be an important component. You also point out this sort of the reverse encroachment issue that we face as all sectors, and I think it's important that we pay attention to that, and there may need to be provisions around rules for where development can occur or where siting of facilities should be. I think there is a need to be looking at that as well.
Thank you.
We are out of time, and I'd like very much to thank all of you for witnesses that are here in person and for the witnesses that are here by video conference. Thank you very much.
Président, une question en français. Est-ce qu'on peut...
Mr. Chair, I have a question for you in French. Can we be sure that next time we will have witnesses, the next time we have witnesses with us by video conferences, that they will have access to the translation services? They do have access? Okay, I'm surprised because several times Mr. Blaney actually interpreted the question. Perhaps I've misunderstood?
Merci beaucoup.
Okay. Meeting is adjourned. Everyone have